Welcome to episode 57 of the Camerosity Podcast, the world's #1 open source film photography podcast. My name is Mike Ekman, and we're back with another exciting foray into the wonderful world of film. With us tonight is returning guest, former employee of Eastman Kodak, author of Making Kodak Film, and all-around film guru, Robert Shanebrook. How are you doing tonight, Robert?
Fine, thank you.
As usual, the gang is all here. Starting us off from Gainesville, Florida, Mr. Anthony Rue. Is it finally starting to feel like fall down there, Anthony?
We had our first cool day today. We had a high of 71 and a low of 47, and I am so happy.
Next, from the land of Vegemite and Tim Tams, is our own Camerosity Podcast authority on jar-based vegetarian spread and chocolate-covered biscuits, Mr. Theo Panagopoulos. Hey, Theo, I just tried Tim Tams for the first time this weekend, and they were pretty good.
Oh, they're fantastic. And they are biscuits. I don't know who the hell decided in the US they needed it to be called cookies. But that's just a travesty.
I was told you're supposed to take a small bite on opposite ends of it and then stick it in milk and use it like a straw. Is that the correct way to eat them?
That is the correct way to eat them.
Seriously?
Yes.
Seriously? That's what you do?
Yes.
It soaks up the milk and it actually turns it into a cookie. It becomes even less biscuit-like the more you soak it up with milk.
Now we're going into dangerous territory.
And finally, from the state that's round on the sides and high in the middle, is Mr. Paul Reibel. Hey, Paul, what do people in Ohio do for fun?
We don't have fun in Ohio.
All right, well, that's a good way to get started off. We have, looks like a couple people in the waiting room, so let's invite them in. All right, Mina's back. Welcome back to the show, Mina.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you all again.
All right, we were just having an intellectual conversation about Tim Tams. Do you have a strong opinion on them?
I do. I don't like them.
Kick him out. Kick him out.
I don't like them. I don't understand. Like, I think I don't mind the outside of them, but the filling is actually not that good.
Jeez.
So
Man,
I'll see myself out. Good day.
There's no Australian unity.
No. You know what it is, Mike? It's you're either a Tim Tam person or a mint slice person. I'm definitely a mint slice person.
Oh, I like both.
Yeah, but Theo, like, that's just sitting on the fence and being Switzerland about it. Like, I think you need to take a decision.
Is a mint slice also a biscuit covered in chocolate that's minty?
Yeah, I think it's like maybe what you guys call a graham cracker with like a paste of mint, like a minty paste, and it's covered totally in dark chocolate.
That would
sounds
be
like a Girl Scout.
The Girl Scout,
Mint.
yeah, Thin Mints,
Okay, yeah.
They're made by Keebler, and Keebler sells them like that, but everybody in the United States knows them as Girl Scout Thin Mint, so they're pretty popular here.
The closest thing I had in the US that was similar to the mint slice is the junior mints, but then imagine it's on a biscuit.
Yeah,
and then
okay.
bigger.
And we also have Jesse Wisdom. Jesse, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me in.
All right, you want to do a quick intro yourself?
Yeah, I started shooting film and photography in general in 2020 and quickly fell in love and do everything from medium format to 8x10 now, but my true passion is instant film of all kinds.
Instant film. Wow. If only you had some instant film to talk about.
I might have a pack or two that came in the mail today.
Nice. All right. Well, we'll get started. And if more people show up, we'll let them in. We're welcoming Robert back. He's been on the show before. In fact, we've had really good luck with some Kodak themed episodes. Our last episode with Todd Gustafson turns out to be our most listened to show ever. So it feels like that's a deep well. We've had Robert on the show before, so we'll try not to repeat too much of what we discussed in those early episodes. But I mean, pretty much anything's up on our show. So Robert, what's new? I mean, anything different since the last time you've been on the show?
I think the one thing that's new is that, Kodak's made a statement they intend on staying in the film business as long as there's demand for film. Up until now, you never quite knew exactly, and they hadn't really made a commitment to stay in the film business. And now they're saying they're going to stay in the film business as long as there's demand for film. That's been helped by Oppenheimer, I think, that's given more attention to cine film. And they've been doing things to improve their ability to finish 35 millimeter magazines. So that's helping their commitment to film. So I'm hopeful and impressed that they're making positive statements.
Would you say that they've had to adjust from 20 years ago to adapt to producing at smaller volumes to stay profitable and make it worthwhile? Like, obviously, 20, 30, 40 years ago, they were just pumping out film like crazy. And to have all that machinery still working today wouldn't be practical. So they would have had to have done some level of downscaling to still be able to do it, but not by running these huge monstrous assembly lines. Is that something? I mean, am I making sense there?
You're making sense. However, they are using the same equipment and they have had to make modifications. The biggest challenge in my time, I retired in 2003, exactly 20 years and 16 days ago. The
Oh, wow.
biggest challenge in my time was making enough that we had factories in various countries of the world. And the biggest problem was making enough film. We had most factories work 364 days a year. We closed down for Christmas and worked pretty much 24 hours a day. And the challenge was balancing production amongst the factories so we could make enough. The challenge today is making huge amounts less. They make virtually tiny amounts today. But because of the ability of the people and the equipment, they're still able to use the same coating machines that they for making emulsion making rooms for making emulsions and for coating, but they've had to adapt somewhat to smaller batch sizes. And in the finishing world, they're using the same spoolers they used when I was there, but there's a whole lot fewer of them. There used to be spoolers all around the world, and now there's only a few, and they're all in Rochester. A few means one or two, by the way. But they've done a lot. I still believe, and probably the best film that's ever been made is the film that's being made today. I don't think they've taken any sacrifice in quality. The emulsion making equipment they use still has the same control of the old ones. They just don't use them as frequently. And they've had to do some modification so that they could handle smaller batches. There's a picture in my book of a small scale. It's called lemur, the monkey lemur. It's a small scale emulsion making, but that device had the same capability as the larger making. It was built for smaller volumes about 30 years ago.
It's interesting you brought up Oppenheimer. I mean, obviously that movie has resonated with a lot of different people for many different reasons. But you're right. You know that Christopher Nolan is a huge fan of film. He's used it before on other of his movies too. But if I remember correctly, didn't he actually get Kodak to create a larger version of Double X that they had never made before?
Yes, they finished it differently. I happen to know from talking to people that sounds like a very easy thing to do, and I assumed it was a very easy thing to do, and I was wrong. The problem was that they ran into for making 65 millimeter camera origination film is that the projectors, or not the projectors, but the cameras used for the IMAX system need very, very accurate perforation location. And they had not developed that for black and white film. And it took some effort, like a couple weeks of effort. And they actually hired somebody back who had previously retired, who was expert in what we called standard perforation, which is a die that goes up and down and punches the holes very accurately. And that took some effort on Kodak's part. They were very modest in saying that they made I think it was Double X film, that they made it in 65 millimeter, but it took some effort. Those perforators and those films were not originally designed to have the perforation accuracy that's required for the IMAX cameras.
Are they double perforated, the IMAX cameras?
It's a conventional 65 millimeter.
Okay. All right.
Perf.
So, Robert, when you step down your production capabilities, it seems to me like it probably is harder to maintain consistency on a lower volume than it would be on a higher volume to stay in control.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I mean, it's the same way in the photo finishing business.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
more stuff you run through the processor, the easier it is to stay in control.
And the more frequently you make the same, okay, there's two worlds, right? If you're a marketing guy, you want film with every roll of film wants to have a different feature. You want perfect film, so you want 100 different kinds of films. If you're a manufacturing guy, you want to make one film, you want to make it every day. But somewhere in between is where reality strikes. In the old days, you'd hope you'd be making color neg or Ektachrome or whatever. You'd hope to be making it a couple times a week. And now I don't think they make the same product as often. So it puts a lot more demand on the emulsion makers so that they end up with the consistency they require. It's not terribly unlike photo finishing in that sense.
Well, let me ask you this, because this is something, as a longtime Eastman Kodak dealer and having spent time in Rochester over the years, we were always told that in the consumer line of film, a roll of film was made with an aim point as to when it would be used. For
Correct.
example, if they made a roll of film in January, it had a certain characteristic. But then in July, they figured that's when it was going to get shot, and it would be a different characteristic. And then in December, as it's aged another 6 months, I'm compressing the time here because it probably is more in years than it is in months. But they're making it with some latitude and some flexibility and the ability for the film to age as time goes on. Whereas you didn't have that with the professional film. The professional films were made to be what they were, and therefore they were kept refrigerated and had no aim point for the use.
That's true. You had a manufacturing aim. That's the aim that you were shooting for about 2 weeks after sensitizing. So you'd have a manufacturing aim. You'd also have a customer aim. And the customer aim would be different depending upon the application. For instance, if you said for professional, the customer aim and the manufacturing aim were pretty close. For consumer Kodacolor, where you might have a couple Christmases on a single roll, then the manufacturing aim and the customer aim would be further apart, and you try to estimate where the film would be at 6 months or 9 months or 18 months later. And you did that, and there's two ways of doing that. One way you did it was based on previous experience, and you had film that you made 18 months ago, and you know where it is today, and you test it periodically through its life. The second thing you would do is incubate it, and you would incubate it through a series of temperature and humidity conditions, and that would give a pretty good estimate. 4 weeks. The worst case would be like 4 weeks at 120 degrees, 40 or 50% humidity. That would pretty much simulate like what it would look like at 2 years. If you went to higher temperatures beyond 120 F, the predictability fell apart. We'd run a test at 140, but you'd always look at that and say, not sure exactly what that tells me at 140 at 2 or 4 weeks, because funny things happen at those higher temperatures. And say we'd run it, we'd have a room temperature sample, we'd have an 80, 100, 120, and 140. We'd never go beyond. I don't recall ever going beyond 140. And you look at those incubated samples periodically to predict how the film would perform in the future. 124 weeks kind of predicts 2 years. So it's erroneous testing. It's pretty predictable.
So in other words, you're just like torture testing the film to kind of estimate its predictability.
Well, what's the other choice is I'll give you a call in 2 weeks and tell you if you can ship. Not really possible.
Yeah.
I have a question / comment about the consistency and quality control. I don't want to say consistency doesn't matter these days, because obviously it still does, but does it really matter as much as it did, like say in the 80s and 90s, where pros were buying cases of the same emulsion lot of E6 film and making sure they got the ISO and filtering right for that whole batch? Like how much of that kind of stuff is really being done these days, especially with E6 film?
I think they're still doing it, but I agree with you that since most films are scanned, you could be a little more flexible. But I'm not. I've asked that question, and nobody will tell me that they've loosened the standards. But the other point is that the other effort that went on with the building of Building 38, which was in 1990, and efforts after that, it doesn't really cost more to make something consistent. In fact, if you get to the point where you're making a consistent product, it doesn't cost you more to do it, and it's the right way to do it. And a lot of work went into developing the technology so you could do it consistently. In the old days, by the old days, I'll say in the 60s, you'd make a lot of film, and most of the effort went into testing to select the good film from the bad film. And there was more bad film than good film. It was, the waste was incredibly high. Starting when Building 38 came out in the 90s, there really wasn't that much waste because the process became predictable and controllable. It doesn't really take a lot more effort to make it consistent than to not make it consistent.
Was that also because Kodak was able to then start working with their upstream suppliers a lot closer as well to make sure that the materials they were providing were also more consistent? Because obviously the consistency needs to start before the actual manufacturing process as well.
Yeah, that was all part of the Building 38 effort. If you were making a component and it wasn't quite right, you'd forward it on to the next guy and tell him, just make a little bit of adjustment to make up for the variability. And that practice was then condemned and wasn't done anymore. We simply product had to be within a very, very strict raw material standard before it would be passed on. And there was a lot of pain endured to do that, because at the beginning there was high waste. But when you make that your mantra and you really try to keep things within control, everything stays within control, and it's a lot easier. And that's why the waste went down. There's two reasons for improving waste from a manufacturing point of view, and this is kind of Deming based quality control. You can either make a lot of stuff and sort the good and bad and throw it away, or you can only make good. And we were to the point that we couldn't. We would have had to add we added a major manufacturing facility every decade from 1890 to 2000 because we couldn't keep up. We couldn't make enough. So you can improve your productivity two ways. One, you can only make good stuff, or you can have another production machine to make some good and some bad and throw it away. So
did Kodak ever consider taking a film that maybe wasn't up to snuff for the pros but was still consistent and rebadging it as a consumer grade? Or did they just wouldn't have done that?
We wouldn't do it. And I'll expand on that one step. I was always under pressure from some of the marketing guys saying, I want to give some film to a school. Don't you have some bad stuff?
Right.
You can
Yeah.
No, we don't do that.
Okay.
If it's not good enough to sell, it's not good enough to give away. If you're giving it to a school, you're doing it because you hope that this person becomes a photographer in the future. Do you want to give them your bad stuff and say, this is what we make? I remember when I was at RIT, we got a box of paper from Xerox. It was still making black and white paper in the 60s. And it wasn't very good, but it turned me off to Xerox, to buying Xerox, which was called halide at that point, halide papers. So I got a lot of grief over it, but I always took the position I'd rather give you good film. If it's not good enough to sell, it's not good enough to give away. So we never gave away. We would destroy B grade stuff. That's what was done in my time.
I have two questions, if possible.
Go for it.
You mentioned, Robert, that you were sort of torture testing the film, and one thing that comes up a lot, I guess, in our region of the world, because of and it may happen also in the States, is the variety of temperatures that we will get throughout the year. And a lot of the times we will see people selling expired film, or maybe even fresh film, not as much, but film in general, where the storage conditions are not known, and therefore it's highly likely that that film has fluctuated from very cold to very hot. So my question is film that has been at a consistent temperature outside of the suggested range, often that's below 20 or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, is it better, or is it more, I guess, your results will be more consistent if I got a packet of film or a roll of film that was stored permanently at 30 degrees? Or is a film that has had fluctuations throughout its life more likely to give you more acceptable results? Or is it the same across the board?
The temperature, it's a chemical reaction. You got chemicals suspended in gelatin. If with time there's a thermal component that will change the reaction. Is a film that varies in temperature will probably be better off than one that is at an elevated temperature for the whole time. The limit being 120. Once you get beyond 120, the rules kind of change, because films don't survive well beyond 120 and things will happen. But generally, it's a cumulative. It's accumulation of time. Like if you cook a loaf of bread, if you're making, I try to make an analogy. You're making a loaf of bread and you cook it for a while at 250 and some at 450. Does that average out to 350? Probably not. There's different things going on. The biggest risk in temperature is if for some reason the humidity seal is broken. Humidity and the so those little film cans and the vapor barrier around 120 in sheet film will make a difference. Humidity has a huge impact, because if it gets into high humidity, the gelatin picks up the humidity and things start to move around and react take place.
Yeah, that makes sense. The second question was, in the heyday when there were regional facilities and regional production, were there differences in the output to mitigate the local variation in temperature? So if you were producing for the Asian market, and for example, you knew that that film was generally going to be sold in areas of high humidity, high temperature, was Kodak Gold there different to Kodak Gold in Europe?
In my time being 1980 to 2003, we did not change film formulas to provide superior keeping to be used in the Asia Pacific region. So we divided the world into chunks: US and Canada, South America, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and Europe, and we can kind of combine East and West Europe. We did not change formulas for the market. We did change aim points. For instance, we made a film called Miyabi for the Japanese market that would change the magenta contrast so that flesh would not appear quite so yellow.
Right, okay.
We made a special film for the Korean market, which was 4x5 sheet film. The film formula was the same, but for the Korean wedding, we called it Korean wedding film. I don't recall the exact name. That would have special packaging, which provided more physical protection. We actually vacuum packed the film, so when it got shipped air, it would not vibrate and get shocking marks on it. And it also sealed it better for humidity. So those sorts of things were done. We were very careful in moving film to Australia and such. We would ship a lot of film by air as opposed to the surface. So because sometimes you'd have problems with getting good temperature control with a ship that has to go around.
The distance, it's just too long for that temperature to be consistent. Yeah.
And if it's going around Africa to get to Australia, or if it's going from Whittier in Los Angeles or Long Beach, it's a long ways. So it would be subjected to things.
While I was researching a Kanishiroku early Konica Perlette, I was reading a book about the early days of the Japanese photo industry. And one thing I found interesting, which is similar to what you just touched upon, is in Japan pre-World War II or even pre-World War I, plate film cameras maintained popularity in Japan much longer than roll film did. Like when Eastman Kodak first came out with the earlier roll films, they didn't market well there because the film that you couldn't air transport it. to get the film to Japan, it just wouldn't survive. Whereas the materials to coat your own plates could be transported a lot easier. So you didn't really start to see too much roll film cameras, in the early Japanese market, Kunishiroku, until like the 19 teens, a good 20 years after it started to get common, or I shouldn't say common, but it started to catch on in America and in Europe about 20 years earlier than it did in Japan, for the exact reason you just mentioned.
The other thing I was thinking of but didn't mention, I'll mention now, was they did make a film. I don't remember what year it started. They make called the Tropical Pack, and you'll see film that's in a soft metal magazine. I assume it was tin, and it was like a film can, and the film was inside this. And what happened was, after the opening of the Panama Canal, Kodak stationed people in Panama at the Tropical Lab. And in the Tropical Lab, they would do processing and film storage tests to make film specifically for use in tropical conditions, such you'd find in Africa, perhaps in Northern Australia, and in Asia and South America. And this lab was set up, and there were people there. And I actually read an article describing the laboratory. The laboratory was divided in half. Half of the laboratory was air conditioned, and the other half was not. So they had dark rooms and such in tropical conditions, open to the Panamanian environment. So I'm sure they went to work, and it was 100 degrees and 90% humidity, and they were doing processing and printing just to make sure the materials would work. And there were tropical packs of photographic chemicals also, because if you know, like D76 and Dectol, if there's any humidity that gets in there, they have a tendency to not do well. So they'd have special packaging for the tropics.
Well, it wasn't even just film too. I mean, cameras were made for the tropics too. You'll see what, they call them tropin or tropical cameras, and they're usually just solid wood. They weren't covered in leather because they realized
different
that
types of wood so that it wouldn't absorb.
Right. There was a lot of effort put into camera making in the early 20th century, and they're very beautiful. They're highly sought after today because they're very pretty. But for that exact reason, the leather that they were using back then would obviously, leather is skin, it would absorb moisture, and you didn't want that.
Yeah, I know Graflex did that too.
Yeah.
There's obviously a film that was made for the South American market called Pro Image 100, which is sold currently, and I quite like that film. It's actually a really nice film. Was that specifically manufactured to handle from what I've read, that was manufactured to specifically handle the higher temperatures without refrigeration. So that was a totally different formula to some of the other films?
It was very similar to the other films. It was more similar than dissimilar. There's two films. There's Pro Image Film that was sold in Latin American region, and Pro Photo Film that was sold in mostly Eastern Europe. Also was sold at a very low price, and Africa, by the way. But to compete in that low price market, but we knew how to make it so that it would withstand the temperature, so we did.
Did that affect the actual image output, or was it expected to lower quality, or it was just different?
It was just different. No one could ever tell the difference. In fact, the printing conditions is, from a photo finishing point of view, the printing codes were the same, so that they could print under the same channels.
Robert, I have a question. It wasn't just Oppenheimer. Rather famously, there's an HBO series called Euphoria that shot its entire second season on Ektachrome, and they had to do a special run of cinematic Ektachrome, which, if you've ever, I used to shoot 16 millimeter reversal, and you have to work with things like internegatives when you're editing and all. But just from a Kodak manufacturing standpoint, they brought back commercial Ektachrome. What was that, Paul? Maybe 5 years ago, they brought back the Ektachrome. The use of it in this series was like a massive order for them. From a Kodak side of things, they've never expanded the line past Ektachrome 100 was what they brought back.
Yeah.
But they used to be that Fuji would have Velvia 50 and Velvia 400, but you don't see that with the Ektachrome. From a Kodak perspective, is it just more difficult to coat Ektachrome at different ISOs, or Is it just that there's just such a limited capacity that they're sort of maxed out just doing the 100 that they have, and that there's just no ability to expand beyond that?
I think it's a demand issue. If you notice, I shuddered when you said they did it on Ektachrome. That's a bear. I mean, you'd much rather have cinematographers shooting color negative film and then make a print from that, because controlling Ektachrome from even in a shooting environment is tough. I mean, particularly if you're shooting a film in which you've got some available light and you've got some provided light, and you got different lights, so now you got to deal with even small color balances will raise hell with you. And you're trying to make sunlight main, and you're trying to fill that becomes difficult. I mean, I can't. In my time in Ektachrome, we had a 50, 100, 200, 400, 160, 64T. Oh, we had an 816 and a flavor of 400 that you could push to 800 and 1600. So it was quite a bushel basket of things you were working with. I think the situation today is you don't sell that much Ektachrome still or motion picture, though there could be applications that come and go. But to have a full portfolio of several speeds, I don't think the demand is there to justify it. And you're not going to, and you don't want to have a film, as you pointed out before, you don't want to have a film that you only make once a quarter. That's not a happy time for the motion manufacturing people. You like to make it frequently, so I suspect that's the case. Will they come out with additional Ektachromes? I don't know.
Interestingly, the show that he's talking about, they actually cross-processed all the Ektachrome they shot too.
Oh, that's an interesting twist.
Well, the Ektachrome for cine processing was a different process than E6 and
Right.
E4. It was EA.
Yeah.
It wasn't EA5? EA.
Well, it was a cousin to E4 and it was a cousin to E6, and they may have called it E5, and there was an E7 too, but it was
never... an EA something or other. But it was very difficult to process. I mean, E6 was actually a very forgiving process in short run. In long run, you really wanted to stay in control because you could get color shift very easily. That couldn't. I mean, with a color negative, if you screw up a color negative in the processing, they can always do something in the printing. But on E6 or any Ektachrome process, you wound up with what you got. So it really needed to be done right, and there wasn't much flexibility in the cine processing on Ektachrome film.
From a manufacturing standpoint, is Ektachrome not easier or more difficult, but just different than reversal?
It's more difficult. E6 film building is more difficult than color neg because you're developing an image, and then you're using the non-developed portion of it, using the other side, and you don't have the tolerances are very small because your eye can pick up very, very small differences. And E6 got to be to a good point. And there's a program called QLab, and QLab helped the laboratories gave them simple tools to stay within control easier. There were other Ektachrome reversal processes such as EA5, which was similar to E6, which was used for aerial.
That's the one I was trying to remember, Robert. Yeah. Because I supplied Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was one of my customers, and they bought EA5 in 5-gallon Cubitainers because they were doing all the aerial processing. That's what I was trying to remember.
Yeah.
The shifts though, the major shifts were when Ektachrome went from E3 to E4 and then to E6, because E3 dates back into the early 60s, and it was actually a light reversal. You had to re-expose the film to a light source to reverse the image. And then when you went to E4, it was a chemical reversal. So that took a lot of the consistency became a lot better with E4 than it was with E3. And then with E6, it was still a chemical reversal, but they lowered the number of steps. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, I processed E2, E3 in the 60s, and my summer job at Kodak one year was processing well, I did color printing, but I also did some E4, E3 processing. So I know what you're saying. And you had to have this bright light, and you did the reversal.
Yeah.
You had to go for total reversal. And if you didn't flash it enough.
And an E3, the E3 process was a 250 watt photo flood bulb at a distance of 12 inches. And think about doing that in total darkness. And well, you weren't in total darkness at that point because you had to have the light on. But if you splashed water on a hot 250 watt bulb, you were certainly going to be, you're going to get showered with glass.
I did that, and you had to be, here you are standing in a dark room, okay, holding a 250 watt lamp with water slopped all over the place. You're standing there holding the thing in front of a sink with hot water in it. If you touch the lamp, even the housing, you're going to get burned. And if you drop it, you're going to get electrocuted. So you got to decide if you're going to want to get hung or shot. I'll tell you another processing story. The first studio I worked in, we processed black and white with a Retin 3, and we had a Retin 3 inspection filter. So here I am, I was a high school kid. Okay, I was like 15 years old. And they said, go in here and you process it and you turn the light on and you look. Well, nobody told me when you turn the light on, you're going to get a shock. So you were inspired not to keep the light on too long, because the whole time the light was on, how much developer had gone over the switch. So the whole time in doing inspection, I'm getting a little shock. Not enough to knock you down, but enough to make you uncomfortable.
A slight correction.
So yeah, Ektachrome is more difficult. It's absolutely more difficult.
Well, back when the studios first started using Ektachrome in 8x10, the big New York studios, it was very slow, and it was made for hot lights. And my favorite Kodak story of all time was the big studio in New York was doing a Christmas catalog. So they had a family group in the living room with the Christmas tree and the family dog and the little kids and everybody around the tree. And so they would shoot 8x10s and rush them up to Rochester, throw them over the fence for them to process. The next day, the film would come back and the art director would call and say, reshoot, dog moved. So they would double the amount of light and get a little higher shutter speed, repeat the whole process, run it up to Rochester, come back, art director calls, says, reshoot, dog moved. So then the art director says, stuff the dog. So they stuffed the dog and ran it up there, shot it again, got it back. Art director looks at it and says, reshoot, dog looks dead.
I think Jesse has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Robert, from the 90s, the Pro series of films like PRT, PRN, PMC, and how similar those are to the current Portra, and like what technologies from those films were adopted into Portra. I have a big stash of some freezer stored stuff of that film, and I really like it a lot, and it's hard to find info about it. So
you mentioned PRN, which was called Pro 100. There was a Pro 400. There was a Pro 400 MC, and there was a tungsten flavor, PRT, as I recall. Those, I'll do the 400s because they're easy. I managed all. Those are all my babies, so I know them well.
Yeah, I figured you would.
Pro 400 was a close cousin to the consumer film at that time. It had a pretty good color saturation and pretty high contrast. Pro 400 MC, which we called Eclipse when it was being developed, stands for medium contrast. It had about a 10 or 15% lower contrast and was totally different than the Pro 400 film. They printed on separate channels. Your photo finishers will. And the Pro, let's see, PRN was Pro 400. I remember shooting a lot of that.
That would be the normal contrast, wouldn't it, Robert?
Yeah, that
would be normal.
It was slow. It was 100 speed.
Right.
And it was a deviation of the consumer 100 speed. No, it was a deviation from the consumer 100 or 200, but it had better sharpness than the consumer film.
It would have been like Portra 160 NC.
Oh,
Normal contrast, normal color.
yeah. And what we did, we took, I remember I retired 20 years ago.
Well, and I'm right behind you. I retired in 2010.
All right. So I
So
worked on that film in 1990, as I recall.
yeah,
What we did, we took the 200 speed, I remember now. We took the 200 speed film and added a little dye to it. We added a dye that absorbed light, but the native film speed was about the same as 200, but by adding a little dye, you got less scatter. You pissed away a little speed, okay, but you got less scatter. And because you got less scatter, the film was sharper. So it was appealing to pros because now you had a 100 speed film that was sharper than any of the other 100 speed films, simply because we added some dye to the 200 speed emulsion so that we didn't get scatter. So we didn't do it in the normal way of improving the grain structure. We got the sharpness by getting rid of the optical scatter that would happen in the emulsion.
I'm trying to remember too. I think at that point also because they had done that, it responded better to flash. It didn't have any the short duration didn't affect either the ASA or the color.
Yeah. What was going on in parallel, and also was in the consumer films, but they didn't really care, was we called iridium doping. We used iridium that would get rid of the reciprocity effect. What reciprocity effect is, you expose the film, you expose the cerebral high emulsion, an electron's liberated, and the electron has a tendency to go back to its normal state. And because we used iridium, the electron stayed where once it left, it didn't come back. And all films after that point had iridium doping. It's talked about in the literature, but not much. We never talked about it in advertising or anything. We would just say it's got better reciprocity. We wouldn't say why. And that's why 64T, which was an Ektachrome film, up the film prior to 64T, you had about a stop reciprocity when you went between 100, when you went between 10 seconds and 100 seconds. With 64T, because of the doping, there's no difference between 1 second, 10 seconds, and 100 seconds. We made up a demonstration where there's this sort of this futurist. I still have the transparent. I think I gave the transparencies to the Eastman House. We had a New York City photographer set up an furniture shot, and we shot it in such a way that we could expose it 1 second, 10, and 100, and we shot them all at the box speed. And there was no difference, and you couldn't tell the transparencies apart. There was no difference in contrast, and there was no difference in density.
That made all the difference in the world of commercial photographers.
Oh yeah, because it's.
I mean, that was a game changer when you did that.
Yeah.
And also for things like do you remember the big shot that you did of Grand Central Station with nobody in it? They used a 1/10,000th neutral density filter. So they had an exposure of like 12 hours or something. And they shot Grand Central Station and there were no people in it because no one stood there long enough to register on the image.
I didn't answer part of the question being relative to Portra. Portra was a clean slate that everything we started from scratch. We actually tried to make another film before Portra, in between the Pro series and the Portra series. And that project was called Iris. And that was a color negative film that never made it to the market.
I thought that was Vericolor 3. Wasn't that the predecessor? No? Okay.
Vericolor 3 was the predecessor. There was Vericolor, Vericolor 2, and Vericolor 3. Vericolor 3 was, there you go. Vericolor 3 was in the marketplace. There was another one that was sort of Vericolor 4, but we never commercialized it. Instead, we did Portra, and that's why it was kind of, there you go. That's why it was there was a longer period before Portra came out than
okay. Then I was falsely under the assumption that was a predecessor. I know it's offered in like the 160 portraits speeds.
Yeah.
And while it's clearly showing its age, that exact film. I have boxes just like that.
3 or the 400. That's where I disappeared off video to go to the fridge because I've got to go at 12. But I would love to learn, and I'm going to come back to the recording once it's released, a little bit more about these and whether or not they, you've mentioned, Robert, that they didn't really predate, or they're not in the same lineage as Portra. But are these the end point to all the color development prior to Portra, or did anything come after this that carried some of the genes of the Varicolor series, or did Varicolor just end?
Varicolor just ended, period. We started Portra with a clean slate, and it was totally all new technology, all new objectives. I'll tell you a short Varicolor story. When we were working on Portra, we went out and actually did tests and did all sorts of stuff to see the difference. And every place we went said, whatever you do, don't discontinue Varicolor 3. No matter what lab or studio you went to, they said, leave me alone. We don't want any more films. Don't discontinue Varicolor 3. Endlessly, that was what we were told. Well, after we came out with Portra, well, you got to cover yourself a little bit when you introduce a new film. What if, despite all your efforts, it doesn't go well? What do? Do you tell customers too bad you got to buy it anyway? Or do you make a little Varicolor 3 just in case? I took the view of, let's make a few master rolls of Varicolor 3 so nobody burns down my house. Photographers are very intense. If they get used to shooting something and they can't get it anymore, they aren't real happy. So we made sizable production run of Varicolor 3 after we came out with Portra. Portra was a slightly higher price too, by the way. We got to the point that people wanted to return their Varicolor 3 and they didn't want to buy anymore. So we actually threw Varicolor 3 away. We had master rolls of Varicolor 3 that we couldn't sell at 15% less than Portra.
Saddens me greatly.
we couldn't sell it at 30% less than Portra. So before we had it in packages, we took master rolls and scrapped them.
Part of the reason that Varicolor was so popular is because it replaced Ectacolor, which was one of the worst films. I mean, it was just a horrible. It was just so. I mean, in hindsight, it was great. When people were using it, it was great. But the difference between Ectacolor and Varicolor was so much that people loved Varicolor, and they related it to how their lives changed when they moved over to it. So that was why Portra, both the 160 and the 400, had such a little bit had some resistance when it first came out, as you said, but it was demonstrably better. I mean, it was a quantum shift to go from Ectacolor to Varicolor, and the same amount of shift to go from Varicolor to Portra.
Yeah, CPS, or let's say it was
CPS,
professional type S and type L.
Yep,
it was a film. CPS was very good at the time. Everybody loved Ectacolor CPS. That was great. Don't screw with my CPS. But then the Kodak, this is before my time. The Kodak guys were wise enough to say, this is a big step forward. Let's come up with a different name. So they took the Verichrome, or Vera for accurate color, and called it Varicolor, and there was Varicolor, Varicolor 2, and Varicolor 3. And each one was a little better than its predecessor. So
yeah, and it shifted from C22 process to C41. Yep. Which was also something, the labs had to deal with that. They had to make the adjustment at that point because a lot of them didn't want to run 2 runs. They didn't want to run 2 lines.
Yeah, and that transition thing is tough. That's why we didn't change C41 for Portra. And one time I was trying to do a replacement for E6, and I couldn't come up with good enough features. So instead, we changed the stabilizer for E6 and moved the formaldehyde, because formaldehyde was an issue with C22 and C41 and in the early Ektachrome. And there were films that still required formaldehyde, but we worked our way out of that.
Some films obviously were more successful than others. Some have lasted generations. Others were gone before you know it. There was a film that I had never heard of before. It was Supra. Where did this fall into Kodak's lineup? Because it's branded Kodak Professional. So, but why haven't I heard more about this film?
That was a film intended for the commercial market, and there was some resistance to the commercial market for using, certainly resistance to consumer film, certainly not appropriate to use pro image or pro photo if you're a commercial shooter. So that was another flavor that was available. There was a Supra 100, if I can get this right, Supra 200, 400, and I think there was a 1600. There was never, I don't think there was a Supra 100.
I remember the 1600.
1600. It was a little higher contrast.
Oh yeah.
Consider that was the biggest difference. Actually, was the palette, where the contrast was much higher on the Supra than it was on the Portrait, because the Portrait was really made for the wedding and portrait markets.
Yeah,
where you didn't want the contrast.
Yeah, Supra had more punch, NC or VC.
It was actually a really good film. The Supra was actually a very good film.
What was its like era? Like from about how long was it made for?
I think I would say
I'm thinking not mid-90s.
Because this box expires in 05.
Yeah, so it would have been made in 2002 would have been the last year of production, probably.
Okay.
Somewhere right in that, because that's when digital was really beginning to seriously make inroads on the.
Yeah, and the portfolio was too big. They had the volume going down. You couldn't continue to make all those films.
I mean, at one point, I don't know if you remember this or not, but Eastman Kodak gave the pro stockhouse dealers refrigerators.
Yes.
We had we actually were given two, not walk-ins, but sliding door, 2 and 3 door sliding coolers to store our film in out on the sales floor.
Yep.
And we would have maybe as many as 10 or 12 SKUs of film with different speeds and different sizes.
Yep.
And the only thing they insisted was you didn't put anything in it but Kodak film.
Yeah, I had seen places that had green boxes in them too. But.
Well, I went out. I bought a Dr. Pepper cooler at an estate sale, and I kept my Fuji film in the Dr. Pepper cooler.
That's
so
cool.
we stayed loyal to Kodak on that.
I know, changing gears here, I know Jesse really wants to talk about instant film. You know, Robert, I obviously that era was while you were at Eastman Kodak, but it didn't go too well for Kodak. They were sued by Polaroid, basically forced out of the market in 86, I think. Yeah. So Jesse, I'll let you talk, but I know you had a couple questions.
Yeah. So I guess my first question is, you probably didn't work much on that side of Kodak, did you? On the instant film side? Yeah.
I knew what was going on, but I really did not do anything.
Right.
Here's what happens in a corporate, at least at Kodak, in a corporate world. If you're going to have a project like that that has to be kept out of the limelight, you set up a silo, and in that silo, you put people to work on that, and you don't let anybody else know what's going on.
Right.
They were in isolation. They had their own buildings and their own people and all their own stuff. I knew it was going on, but I had no knowledge whatsoever. I had no.
Right.
Was it even in Rochester?
It was all in Rochester.
It was Rochester. So okay.
Yeah. A lot of the info I've learned is from the late Ron Mowry. He posted a lot of good information on APUG over the years about Kodak Instant.
Didn't Kodak though, like in Polaroid, weren't they cooperating though in like the 60s? Kodak was producing the negative side of the instant film, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of unhappy people in Rochester. that whole Polaroid thing went. As I understand it, this is my speculation. Kodak bent over back, and I know people who did this. Kodak bent over backwards to help Dr. Land. And this is documented in many different places. And saw that as an opportunity. We'll make the negative film and we'll make a few bucks on that. And we'll participate in instant in that fashion. There's a lot of angry people felt that Kodak should not have been as generous with him as they were.
Not especially after they sued the crap out of him.
Well, yeah, but in the beginning, he had no. If Kodak had just said "go away," I'm not sure how long Polaroid would have existed. But instead, they saw an opportunity to make negative product, and that was profitable. And I will tell you some. I say I didn't have anything to do with it, but I also managed Type 55. We made the negative for Type 55 up until the very end of Type 55. I interfaced with Polaroid for that, but I had nothing to do with the color business. But we made the negative for Type 55 for 30 years. I was only involved for maybe 5.
And that was a peel apart film, right?
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
a peel
okay.
apart film. Most of it was sold in Japan, despite what Americans will tell you. We sold tremendous amounts in Japan. I don't know where it all went in Japan, but it was very popular in New York and commercial. But we sold even more in Japan. I just don't know where it all went in Japan. I actually went to Japan one time trying to figure out where it all went.
I've been finding some boxes of them Japan recently.
Okay.
The negative was definitely the best part of 665 or 55. The print quality was crap compared to what you could get from the negative. Would actually, if you cleared it properly and washed it, it would make a very nice fiber-based print.
Yeah, it was an excellent. The negative was good. It was fine grain. As I recall, you gave it a stop more exposure than would give you a good print, and you put it in a sulfite. Yeah. And they made a little Tupperware looking
clearing bath.
And they were nice negatives. And we sold it to them, and we just basically sold them a roll of film. It has the words on it. The Kodak documentation called it Panatomic X, but it had no relation whatsoever to Panatomic X.
Got me excited.
That's Mike's favorite film is Panatomic X. So you got his attention when you said that.
Panatomic X has very, very good tone reproduction, but the sharpness and grain isn't nearly as good as TMax 100.
That Type 55, the Ben Fraternale, he did the video with you, Robert. That Type 55 he shot of you for that video, that actually, I'm pretty certain I sold that box to him.
Oh.
And that lot of 55, I drove up to Chicago a couple of years ago and bought 91 boxes of 4x5 peel apart from a forensic lab.
91 boxes. Wow.
Yeah, it had been cold stored the whole time. They had used it to take photos of fingerprints for evidence. And it took them a while to switch to digital because, the software had to be written that could hold up in court compared to a Polaroid where you have the image and that's that. So they used it until about 2010. And they had bought a ton when it got announced to discontinued to stock up for that purpose.
Yeah, we used to make that. We only made that I'm trying to think. I think we made it 3. We delivered to them 4 times a year.
So Kodak made the negative for 55 up until 2008 when Polaroid went under.
Well, whenever they stopped selling it,
okay,
they certainly would not have anybody else. It'd be too much trouble to come up with anybody other manufacturer's film. Wouldn't be worth the effort.
Okay, Robert, on collaborations like that, obviously back in the day when Kodak was competing very aggressively with Fujifilm and Ilford to some extent, I imagine there would have been no collaboration between those companies because there's, obviously you're competing very aggressively. What's happened recently is Fujifilm discontinued C200 and it reappeared as Fujifilm 200. And it's been touted as it's actually manufactured by Kodak. I think it's Color Plus 200. That's actually, so Color Plus 200 and Fujifilm C200 are now effectively the same film. Was there actually any collaboration happening at those days, or was it purely, they're the enemy and we can't possibly share any sort of knowledge?
Well, we're grown-ups, okay? We don't. The sales guys might, spit in each other's coffee, but when we would buy them a cup of coffee and be nice. But here's what didn't. First, I'll tell you what didn't happen, and then what didn't happen. You would be very careful. Never have any economic price discussions. That's illegal in the United States. So we would never do that. There were programs like APS. Remember, APS was a collaboration. Camera and the big dogs were Kodak and Fuji. I had nothing to do with APS. Well, I had a little to do with it, but not seriously. And I knew the APS guys, and I knew the discussions that were going on. The reason APS is 24 millimeters is not because of Kodak, but because of Fuji. Kodak wanted to make it 35 millimeters. and the Japanese would not stand for it. So that became 24 millimeters. They needed a small camera, and the Kodak guys wanted a bigger one, but it never happened. There were constant discussions. Well, I'll do one more APS thing. This is important. In the APS world, in the legal world, you can talk about what you want, the end product, but you can't talk about how you're going to get there. For instance, you can say the film's going to be 24 millimeters wide. It's going to have a magnetic coating on one side. It's going to be in a magazine that's this big and has this resistance, and this is what the DX coating is going to be. But you can't say, I'm going to build a piece of equipment that in this fashion will make the magazine. I can tell you what the end product is. We can discuss that.
Right.
We can talk about how we're going to get there. So you can't talk about price, and you can't talk about how you're going to manufacture things, because that becomes a patent issue. You can exchange patents, like on the magazine that was developed jointly, I think. The other thing that goes on is I have a technology, and he mentioned Kanisaruko. Konica has pretty good technology, though they were never particularly commercially successful. There were things that Kodak would trade with Konica, or Fuji and Kodak would trade with Konica. And Kodak and Fuji would trade things, and we talked very civilly to each other. There was no animosity. That's not always the case with Polaroid, I don't think. But Kodak and Fuji, they would come here and we would go there. And I met with Fuji on a number of topics. They'd have a technical patent that we're interested in, and we trade. I'll let you give you rights to this patent if you give me rights to that patent. And then that gets into a whole thing about how much is my patent worth. I'll give you 2 patents for that one, and no cash ever changed hands, I don't believe, by the way.
There's a lot of examples of that in the photo industry. I mean, even going back to the 1930s, Nippon Kogaku made the lenses and mount for Canon's first camera. In the 60s, Ricoh and Gaff, General Aniline Film, who was over AGFA and ANSCO, they exchanged patent.
Yep.
So I mean, there's a lot of examples where there was sharing between two companies, sometimes unrelated. And in regards to APS, it's amazing to me that it ever even was released at all, because of how many people were involved in it. I did an article on it last year, and it was almost 50 different companies between filmmakers and camera makers who in some way were involved in the development of that. So, all these different people that all had their ideas and priorities for what they wanted out of it. The fact that APS ever got finished at all, I think is kind of a miniature miracle in of itself.
Yeah.
I think it's more of a tragedy than a miracle. I mean, there were some technological advances that came out of APS.
Yeah.
But the cost of it basically bankrupted a lot of companies. It put them on very poor financial footing. It hurt a lot of dealers, labs in particular. The labs who came in and spent a lot of money on APS processing equipment and never recovered the money from it.
Right.
That was more of a timing issue, though.
It was
wasn't
the
it?
timing.
It was timing. It was too near the end of the. It was too near the beginning of the end of the digital, or the beginning of the digital era. And there were a lot of people in the industry who knew that. A lot of people in the industry said this is going to bankrupt a lot of people, and no one listened to them because they were too far into it at that point. They could not back out of it. But when they announced it, how long was it on the market before it really? The sales were only like 3 or 4 years before it really went away.
Yeah, that kind of falls under the classification as it's probably better to do something than nothing. And I think there was a certain desperation involved. And I actually know my contemporaries ran that. Never told by top management, come up with something. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
The world's going to change, and we got to do something to keep this. We got to do something to keep the golden goose alive.
I found an article from 1979. Herb Kepler wrote about it. And there was a prototype new Kodak film. I don't know if the name Evan Albert Edwards rings a bell, Robert.
No, but I knew Bert Kepler though.
He wrote this article about this new type of Kodak film, and I have an article of it on my website. I'll send it to you, but I'll include it in the film notes. But it looks very much like APS film. It has a lot of the same characteristics: a tongue, single perforations, a cassette that actually uses feelers to communicate back to the camera, the film speed, the type of film. You know, it was basically pre-DX encoding. It used the gasketed rectangle that you always see on the back of a film door, where you could peep through to see what's written on the actual cassette itself. You know, there's a lot of different. I mean, it was an APS film, but it at least had some of the similar characteristics of it. And that was 1979. It obviously never made it anywhere. For whatever reason, that film it didn't make it past the prototype stage. But had that been more successful, some of the advantages that APS did have, if it had come out in the early 80s, I think it would have been totally different. You know, there would have been much more time before digital photography destroyed it. You know, APS was just too close to the end. But I think had something like that come out 15, 20 years sooner, it would have been a game changer.
That's the story of the industry.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware. I'm not aware of that 1979 article.
I'll send it to you. Yeah, read it afterwards. It's pretty interesting. So we've talked a lot about film. Obviously, that's your expertise. You know, we dabbled a little bit into instant film. I wanted to ask a question, Robert. I know you're not a lens guy. I have one of these, an Aero Ektar. So these were aerial cameras. One of the ones that's most commonly used in is the Fairchild K20. Do you have any knowledge of Eastman Kodak's production of lenses during World War II?
I am a lens guy. I worked in optics research from 1969 to 1974, and I also worked on spy satellites.
That's right. You have the stereo camera on the moon, right? You told us last time.
Yeah. So I am familiar. Don't sleep with that, by the way.
Keep it away from the boys, right?
Okay. One of the problems in making lenses is to get high refractive indices, and the only way to do that is with radioactive glass. That particular lens has thorium in it, and as a result, if you took a piece of film and you put it next to it for 6 months or 9 months or something, you'd probably fog the film. Those high index lenses were made, and that's an f2.5. What's the focal like?
178 millimeter.
Right, or 7 inches.
I used to own one of them, but I don't anymore. Those lenses were made during the war, after the Second World War.
This one's 1943.
They were made at Hawkeye. They made their own glass at that point. The lenses would be ground and polished and assembled at Hawkeye. That lens was probably designed by Dr. Kingslake. I don't know that for a fact, but whoever designed it worked for Kingslake, so it was designed under his supervision.
Would there ever have been a commercial application for this? Paul's got one too.
You got commercial Ektars in 8.5, 10, 12, 14 inches. Same guy who assembled commercial Ektars probably put that lens together, and and there was wide field Ektars too, which are excellent.
Which one is that, Paul?
That's a 305 millimeter,
yeah,
2.5 Aero Ektar. It weighs 16 pounds. It has no iris in it. It was made for aerial photography. Of course, it didn't really need to have an iris.
See, this one does.
Yeah, that one does. Yeah,
it does. Okay, all right, because it's got click stops and everything.
But these are used today for tintype photographers. You know, the trick is to get a camera that the mount could actually hold it, because it weighs so much.
So heavy.
But hang on, I need to ask this. Paul, have you adapted it to Micro Four Thirds with all your adapters?
I think Kurt had an adapter, but no, that lens didn't come from Kurt. That came from someone else. That lens does not have thorium in it, fortunately, because it'd be an awful lot of thorium or LAK9.
Isn't thorium yellow though?
Yeah, thorium gives you the yellow cast on the glass.
Maybe I see a little yellow cast.
Only when it ages, though, isn't it?
You can age out the thorium, the yellow cast, if you expose it to a bright UV light for a period of time. It'll take the yellow cast out. but it's still radioactive.
The front lens element, or even the front grouping, is very clearly like got a little bit of a blue to it. So there's, I don't know if that's their luminized coating that they used back then.
Those lenses were really, really prone to element separation.
Okay.
And what you would see inside would be a series of lines. It looked like a fingerprint, and you'd see it going through the glass. Not all of them had it, but they it was something that happened. I've had a number of those. Those are fantastic lenses.
Yeah. I do see a tiny bit of haze. I mean, very, very, very little near the edges. But I mean, overall, I'd say this is a 9 out of 10. I know there's a lot of people on eBay that make 3D printed adapters for Grayflex press cameras. So you could buy this one doesn't have an adapter. It's ready to go. So you literally just buy that plate, put it on there, and boom, this thing can shoot some 4x5s or whatever. So I was just curious.
Those are all the rage these days.
They're very desirable. And I mean, I have no use for this. I don't have anything I could do with it. But I mean, just holding it, I guess now that I know it's radioactive, it's probably, although I'm done having children, it's probably okay.
Just don't lick it, mate.
I won't lick it. No, I'm not gonna lick it. No, I was just curious, like what you could tell me about it, because I know that, like Jesse said, they're all the rage right now.
So, Robert, this is a bit of a digression, but the last time you were on, you were talking about your spy satellite work, and just last week I rewatched Ice Station Zebra for the first time since I was like 10 years old, and it just seemed to me that was your project that kicked off the entire film, except for, of course, in the plot of the film, the Russians had stolen your invention from the U.S.
I've probably watched that 5 or 6 times. The biggest difference is the film they're dealing with. This looked like a 100-foot roll of 16 millimeter. In reality, the film was 9.5 inches wide and several hundred feet long.
Wow, that was big.
Oh, yeah. Well, that big. Well, they were even bigger. Later satellites, one called Hexagon, you probably won't believe me when I tell you this, but it carried a 30-mile long roll of film, 150,000 feet long by 6.6 inches. Think about it.
It's a lot. You could slice that down to Minox and be good for life.
Yeah. The roll's 6 feet in diameter by 6 inches wide. Earlier ones in the time of Zebra were like 3,000 feet, and they were 9.5 inches wide.
Yeah, you had to give the jet a good target to catch with the hook.
Yep, and they jettison them. And in fact, we're going to have a guy come and talk to us in the next few months that flew one of those airplanes.
Wow.
That he actually, the parachute will come down and they catch it out of the air. And the joke is, if you're a pilot of one of those, you're probably going to have a rank change. If you catch it, you probably get promoted. If you miss it, not so good.
Those kind of applications are so interesting. I think younger people like me say that there's a film resurgence these days, but they don't consider things like that. Just how much film was being used on stuff like that that's been completely supplanted by digital.
Yeah, then look at X-ray.
Yeah.
Nobody uses film and screens anymore. Everything is digital.
My dentist still does.
Only in Australia.
Yeah. I have a dental eye. I have a Yashica dental eye. I want to try and shoot some bugs, some pictures. I was thinking I should bring it to my actual dentist and be like, hey, have you ever seen one of these? And he's an older guy. He probably has. I'd be like, can you like take some pictures of my teeth with it? So I could review it or something, see if he could actually get it to work. It's a neat little camera. It's got a ring light permanently attached to the front of the.
I've got one of the Jim Dine 105 macros for K-mount, and it's a really fantastic lens.
Lester Dine that was his industry. I mean, he made cameras for law enforcement and for dentists. And basically, you would just take somebody else's camera and a Curon lens and a Sunpack flash unit and put them in a nice fitted case and sell them. Then I did the same thing, but for different law enforcement applications. But yeah, those are great. Those are a lot of fun.
Jesse's point earlier, I mean, how much film was being used absolutely everywhere. Recently, one of the local companies actually cut down film from the old red light cameras or traffic cameras that must have gone through just miles and miles of film all the time and sold it commercially for people to do what they like with it. But that point is, you don't realize how many areas film was just being used in absolutely everything that we take for granted these days, which are just digital cameras everywhere.
A lot of Kodachrome got used in the dental industry and in medical. I used to occasionally go to Fairlawn, New Jersey, where the Kodak had a Kodachrome. When I was doing Kodachrome, I would go to Fairlawn, and you'd have to do this at night, and they would take the film off a processor and then run it through this no-touch projector so we could look at it to see what the quality was doing. It was sort of a downstream look at the quality, but amazing amount of film was law enforcement, dental, a lot of autopsies.
I always reference those when I talk about Polaroid's bankruptcy. It's something like 65% of Polaroid's business was non-consumer.
Yeah.
How did that work though? Back in the days where dentists used like actual X-ray film, did a dental office have like a mini lab in the back or something?
That's what my dentist has. He actually processes it. He just takes it away into the other room, and he's got a little processing thing, and he does it.
Yeah,
and it comes back. Yeah,
there were a number of processors. They were not much bigger than a printer. They were very simple. I don't recall the names. We made a developer called KRX, which was just a high, sort of like a D19, if you know what that is. Sort of a D19 developer, just a high energy developer. And very simple. You'd either pick up the rack and move it manually, or they have this simple transport, like a little photo finisher thing. And you'd put the chemicals in and let them run for a week. Maybe you replenish, maybe you wouldn't. And then they sort of washed them. And that's how they would do their little dental bites. They came in plastic. You put it in your mouth.
I mean, my dad was a dentist and then an orthodontist, and he always developed his own film right there in the back of the office. And he used me as the guinea pig in setting up his X-ray equipment, which I may end up paying the price for that. Who knows? Because they took a lot of pictures of me when I was a kid.
Jeez.
But it was fun for me because I got to go in the back and see the development and all. And I mean, he also let me play with like vials of mercury.
Anthony, your photo albums must be really weird.
They are.
His teeth are radioactive, and was it the Mad Hatter? Because they would form hats used with mercury, so you're gonna go crazy and have messed up teeth before you die. I had a question for or not really a question, but Jesse, you brought something up about there's this resurgence of film. There's definitely an interest with younger people with film photography. A discussion that prompted something Anthony did recently. He went up to Atlanta because KEH had a VIP. Anthony, you could tell more about it. But how I'm linking these two stories together is there is very clearly an interest in film from a younger crowd. However, I would argue that interest is still very, very specific. Anthony, when you were at KEH, so why don't you real quick spend a minute and talk about it? And then what types of people were there? And more importantly, what types of cameras were you seeing there?
It was an event that was co-sponsored by KEH Camera and a lab out west called The Dark Room. And they called it Film Stock 2023. It was a series of events. It was also with a group called Beers and Camera. And they had a couple of Beers and Cameras meetups where you just sort of like hung out at a bar or a brewery and whipped out your camera, and people would just sort of talk to you based on what you had. And then they had what was supposed to be a sort of, I thought it was going to be like a guided photo walk where they had flown in like 6 or 8 very young YouTube influencers who were very much treated as like a separate VIP class. They got like private tours of KEH's vault, which I hate to break it to them, but it's nothing compared to Paul's basement. And then the photo walk, instead of actually like interacting with these people, it was more like a photo flash mob that was just unleashed on the Beltline Park in Atlanta. And it was about 150 people that just showed up with a camera, and they're like, well, what are we supposed to do? We just sort of like walk down this trail and take pictures, I guess. And I got stopped more than by anybody that was at the event. People that were not at the event were like, what the hell is going on? Is this some sort of a prank? I mean, what is it with all these old cameras out here? The people that were just like on the Beltway, they had no idea why there were suddenly 150 film photographers walking around taking their pictures. They were like out for a Saturday stroll. But it was a fun day. It was a beautiful day out in Atlanta, and I got some great shots myself. But what was very surprising to me is that the average age had to have been under the age of 25, and overwhelmingly there were Leica M bodies, and then Pentax 6.7s, and Mamiya RB 6.7s, and then just a scattering of Hasselblads. I think I saw 2 Rolleiflexes, and that was the overwhelming majority were people that were very young, shooting very nice rangefinders,
Prestige cameras.
they're absolutely prestige cameras.
Yeah.
And I was there, and I was shooting my 1939 Voigtlander Superb, and was completely invisible because it's just not a camera that anybody had ever seen before. I mean, you can't impress somebody if they have no idea what it is that you're shooting.
But didn't you show them your Instagram feed and like people like thought you were like speaking another language?
Yes, yeah. Because, and especially when I showed my Flickr page, which sort of indexes all my cameras, and people started scrolling up through, and their eyes sort of glazed over after the first few screens of cameras, because most of them, I'm sure, spent a lot of money on like 1 or 2 very nice cameras, and that's what they're going to shoot, which is fine. I mean, they're definitely getting great shots out of their M6s and their Summicron lenses. But it was just it's kind of interesting, because if you go back and like look at the hashtag for Film Stock 2023, it's the old story that you can buy the fastest car on the track, but if you don't know how to drive it, you could beat it with a station wagon. At least it was that way in autocross. That you saw people that just didn't really have like a great mastery of like working with light and understanding light dynamics.
You've set up my question kind of for Jesse, which is, so clearly there's an interest. Younger people are shooting film, but I wonder though, how many of them really care to learn the history? How many of them actually pay attention? Like, do they think that you must use an M6 to be able to shoot film? Do you have to use a Pentax 6.7, the neck breaker? This gargantuan, impractical camera that's not meant to be a walk around, a photo walk type camera. Jesse, you impressed me earlier with your knowledge of Fuji Ace instant cameras, and you have a huge amount of interest in a lot of this stuff. But I would argue that even within the minority of film shooters, you're a minority, because I don't think there's too many younger people that are interested in film beyond what Kim Kardashian has, or what Petapixel's telling them that they should be shooting. Am I off on that?
I think by and large, the Gen Z and younger millennial crowd, it very much is a hype thing. Like whatever the YouTubers get, I'm gonna get that because I watch the YouTubers. And like I'm an outlier. I'm a super nerd. I love reading about history of stuff, and I want to know about chemical processes and the specific sensitized metallic dye developers in certain types of instant films versus another. But I will say too, though, there is a bigger crowd than most people realize of people my age that are enthusiastic about it. I'm on a couple of Discord servers, one specifically instant film focused, and one is mostly film but all photography. And I'd say between those 2 servers, there's probably 300 to 400 active people in their teens and 20s that are more nerdy about it and less in the hype side. But I do think, like, by and large, like I'm really close with one of my local labs, and they say probably 85% of the young people don't even pick their negatives up when they bring film in. They don't want the negatives. They just they want the scans, and they don't care about anything else.
It occurs to me though, and again, tell me if I'm wrong, but it occurs to me that there's still people like this podcast, and I'm 45, so I'm young for the old crowd, right? But there's people still that are interested in the history and the nerdy aspect of it, and they remember a lot of the characteristics of these old cameras and these film stocks and these lenses firsthand. And then you're telling me that there's these Discord servers where there's younger people who are really getting into the nerdy side of it too. But I kind of feel like those 2 groups aren't talking to each other. You got a bunch of people my age and older that are talking to each other. Jim Gray from down the road did a survey on his site a month or two ago where he asked his readers, like, what's your age? Like, I'm just curious to know what the demographics of my site are. And like overwhelmingly, it was people 50 and up. You know, the number one occupation of readers on his site were retired. So there's still a group of people that love film and love photography and love the history and the nerdy parts of it. And there's this newer, younger group that's starting to get interested too. But
Yeah,
I don't think they're talking to one another. How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think part of it's historical though, because what's happened is when younger people were starting to get more interested in film and have been, there was too many older people who were like, "Get off my lawn!" No, or
They're still
preaching
there.
or telling them what is correct rather than helping them explore and enjoy. I mean, and that will create that divide. Look, I've seen slightly different in the photo walks I've joined here in Sydney, where there has been younger people who are actually quite interested in things like that, but they don't necessarily want to listen to a bunch of old guys on a podcast or anything like that. But they do their research. They pick cameras, they pick unique cameras. They don't necessarily just stick to the M6s and so on. We got to be careful we don't sort of paint a picture of what we think certain groups of people are like through forums and internet chats and
right.
and stuff like that. Having said that, I do want to actually ask Robert a particular question, which probably will make me sound like the old man raving his fist at the clouds, but I will ask it anyway. A term that gets thrown around a lot now is, let's talk about particular film stocks, like, you know, Kodak, Color Plus, Portrait, etc. But they use the word film stock. Back in the day when I was using film without any digital, it was like, let's talk about a particular film. They weren't using the word film stock. Is that an industry term, or is that just something that's sort of evolved and people just sort of say it now as films, you know, say film stock rather than just a film?
I think it's a motion picture term. I don't think it's a still. The term stock in the still world means selling old images through a stock picture service, the stock business. But the motion picture people use the term stock, in my time, use the term film stock when they were referring to the motion picture. And we use the term, in the still world, we use the term emulsion, which is a misnomer, but they were talking about a particular film batch or a particular film type and just used interchangeably. And we in manufacturing call them emulsions, even though they're actually dispersions. That's just some history.
Okay. And if I can get back to the event, I mean, I don't mean to belittle all these people that were out there shooting with these other cameras. I mean, obviously, if you bought an M6, you're enthusiastic about what you're doing. And, you know, these people were delighted to be able to meet these people from YouTube that have, you know, 1 million followers and are very much influencers. I'm a bit jaded, and I look at it and think, you know, these people, you know, I shoot expired film that is older than these people giving this advice. Well, yeah, you know, it's like, you know, I still have 300 feet of the Eastman 5220 XT from 1965. It was funny because somebody asked if I had ever shot expired film, and I'm like, sure, I shoot expired film. He's like, well, do you have any with you? And I'm like, yeah. Do you want to trade? And I was like, it just so happened to have, you know, an old steel can film Ferrania P30 from the 1980s, and he looked at me with like, you can still shoot film from the 80s? And I was like, sure, what do you have? And he's like, I've got some Color Plus that expired last month. And I was like, sure, let's trade. You know? But you know, it just never crossed their mind that expired film would be anything older than like maybe a year or two expired. And, you know, when I think of expired film, it's just like, you know, I've talked to Robert about this. I've got like a 150-foot roll of tech pan from the mid 70s that I'm shooting with, developing with the POTA developer, and just absolutely loving that film. But with these people at the film event, you know, it was interesting because not a single person that I talked to, and I talked to probably 50, 60 people over the course of a day and a night, and not one person had heard of our podcast. And I think part of that is that I maintain the Instagram account where we post photos of all the cameras we talk about, and there's a fair amount of engagement with that. But a lot of the primary discussion is in a Facebook group. And I hate to tell you this, guys, but shooters that are under the age of 25 are not lurking around on Facebook groups, looking for
100%.
information about podcasts. So we're not reaching these people because we're not talking in the world where they exist.
Maybe we could talk afterward and get something going.
I really been wanting to do that for a while now. I'm not saying I want to switch like demographics or anything. I mean, I'm not going to just suddenly stop posting on Facebook, but there is a group and there's two groups that like the same thing, but they're not talking to each other. And I don't know how to do that.
It's just the difference of platform used, honestly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Most Gen
I
Z
agree.
gets their info from TikTok and talk to their friends on Discord nowadays.
We need to hire you, Jesse, to make TikToks for us.
I unfortunately very familiar with TikTok, so
I'll send you some Ace film.
now you're speaking my language.
I got two boxes here. Can I entice you into this wonderful? Anybody ever seen a cat in a camera in a can?
I have not.
It's a Holga. It's some kind of Holga instant camera. I use my phone. It's all written in Japanese. I use my Google Translate app on my phone to translate the Japanese text. Somewhere on here it says makes cat noises. So I'm picturing. I have this thing for sale, but part of me wants to just screw it and just open it up because I want to try this thing out. But I'm picturing a cat-shaped camera that when you press the shutter release, it goes meow. I know that's a little bit crazy, but I feel like there's something there to these because I see enough reaction videos. There's a lot people love unboxing videos, just very, very quick. And I'm not good at that. Anybody who's been to my site, I can't stop writing. So my long form reviews clearly aren't reaching a younger demographic, and I completely understand why. But I feel like we need some kind of bridge to share that knowledge, not even just for this show, just in general. So it's not just a bunch of old farts in an echo chamber bitching and moaning about Gen Z, and then a bunch of Gen Zs on their own echo chamber not benefiting from all this knowledge that still is out there.
Yeah, I think both sides would have ways to benefit each other. The older
Absolutely.
generation with the knowledge and the younger generation to bring fresh life into an older medium and show that people do love this medium that people have loved for decades and decades.
For sure.
We just have to keep the gatekeepers out, though. That's the key.
I will say that when I showed up to the Beers and Camera at night with the Fuji G617, I was no longer invisible.
Oh, there's been a couple of YouTube videos about that one.
Everybody wanted to stop and talk to me about the 617, which was fun. I actually really enjoyed all the conversations, and pretty much everybody I talked to started following the podcast or following the Instagram site. But yeah, I mean, I think that there are, generally speaking, these people were very excited about photography, but they're just, and I just hate to say this, but as much as we're an echo chamber, the Gen Z YouTube channels are also echo chambers. Thus, the RV67s, the people were just like melting out on the sidewalks of Atlanta in 90-degree heat, lugging around those RV67s and treating them as if they were some sort of a point and shoot. It's just a totally wrong application for that camera, but they were very proud to have those cameras out there.
And not having fun.
Boy, they were uncomfortable.
Speaking of wide, you mentioned wide, and linking back to our previous episode, just quickly, I was out shooting with Mina. It's a shame he's left because he had to go do something. But I was shooting with Mina on Sunday, and at the recent camera market in Sydney, he actually picked up a Horizon wide camera. I know, Anthony, that's one of your favorite cameras. And man, he went through some film on that one. So that was fun. I've seen some of his results. It was he's got a bit of a light leak, but that's a nice camera. It's the first time I've seen one in person. That's a nice camera.
You mentioned wide. We're running low on time here, but I want to share two bits of gas. Both wide angle, a camera that I've always heard a lot about, but I've never seen one in person. But I got one of these beauties, a Lomo LC wide.
Read my review, Mike.
Read your review. Now, one thing I should have read it because I did not realize this can shoot half frame too. You can switch.
And square.
It can do square too?
Yeah.
So that's probably what FS/S means, full frame, square, and then half frame. And I thought it's interesting in half frame mode, it just halfway opens.
Yep.
And then it's got a double exposure lever on it too. It's got auto exposure. Neat little camera.
Little trick with those, Mike, is shoot half frames, but shoot a panoramic in half frames.
Okay.
And you end up with like a diptych on steroids.
A super diptych.
Yeah.
A super diptych. And then my other find, it's not the camera, it's just the lens that's on here. But for Paul, you were talking earlier in your camera crypt, you've gotten down to leaves and stems, but you know that in all these boxes of cameras that you've been rifling through for the past 3 to 4 months, sometimes there's buried gems. And that's where you got to be very careful when going through an old collection. You have to open every box, every bag, unzip every little pouch of a camera bag, because you never know what's going to be in there. And I found this in the bottom of a box with a bunch of crap. It was wrapped up in cellophane, but it's a W Nikkor 25 2.5 centimeter f4 rangefinder lens. If you look at how narrow that is, this thing is in excellent shape. This lens is so small, you can't even focus it on the lens. You have to use the wheel on the camera to actually get the lens to focus properly. The viewfinder, I found a Fotelander one too, but to just find, I'm really excited to try this lens out, a 25 millimeter Nikon rangefinder lens. I think it's going to be a ton of fun. The depth of field on this thing, it's basically fixed focus. There's a depth of field scale on here. At f8, everything from just barely over 4 feet to infinities in focus, and that's at f8. It stops down to 22. Even at f11, probably 3 feet to infinities in focus. So it's effectively a fixed focus Nikon rangefinder. So
that's a very valuable lens.
Yeah, I looked it up.
I've had a dozen of them and like a thread mount, but I've never had one in S.
Yeah, they made it in both S. The Leica mount's actually even more rare, because I looked it up in Bob Rodoloni's book when I first found it. But I'm really excited to shoot this. I'm really excited to try out the Lomo. Two very different ways of getting wide angle, but I'm a huge fan. I like wide angle much more than tele, so I'm interested in that. So Anthony asked to borrow with an option to buy my 10F with the 25 millimeter, so another 25 millimeter lens, f4, but obviously it's half frame. And I'm going to send you another camera. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I think you'll be happy to give it a shot too. So you should have a package coming. Jesse, I'm going to send you a box too, another one. We'll talk after the show.
All righty.
Before we go though, we got Bob's book. It's, you had mentioned to me this went out of print, right? Didn't Robert?
I had another printing done.
So it was out of print, and then you had a new run of it. So you have it for sale again.
I need to get one of those, definitely.
I only have 5 books left.
Okay.
I'm probably going to have another printing, because people keep saying they want to buy it, and I hate to deprive anybody of having a book.
Well, we'll put a link in the show notes.
Okay.
Of how to order them.
Yeah, 454 pages, hardbound. It'll make your head spin. There's a lot of technical details in here, but it is
right up my alley.
Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm showing the back cover, and it's like so many different kinds of film stocks.
The back cover was a joint effort between your former guest, Todd Gustafson, and me. We spent an afternoon almost killing ourselves falling on ladders. I owned most of the film in that back cover, but some of it, maybe half of it, belonged to the Eastman house.
All right, well, that's a good point to stop. Wanted to thank Robert once again for coming back. It's always super fascinating. The level of knowledge you have and can remember, even though you've been retired for 20 years, is just so impressive. I say it almost every episode, but we need to preserve these stories. Jesse, welcome to the show. I know you said you've listened to all the episodes before, but thank you for coming on. I just enjoy having any kind of new listener, but to have someone as passionate about, this community and everything that we do is extra good. Mina had to leave, but we have the regular hosts here. I think we settled on next episode 58. We're going to go back to a brand specific episode and cover Yashica. Yashica is a company that from the very first moments of me getting back into film, I had a Yashica Electro, and I have a soft spot for that camera still to this day, even though it may not be the most technically impressive one out there. Yashica owned Nikka. Nikka rangefinders are excellent. Many people I know that repair Leicas will say that a Nikka rangefinder is very close, if not just as good as the real thing. They're very well built cameras. They're very fun to use. Yashica used Tomioka lenses on a lot of their cameras, and optically excellent Yeshinon lenses. I just picked up a Pentamatic today, which is in great shape. So I think there's a lot to discuss there from the very beginning, their TLRs to that goofy Yashica Samurai camcorder, half frame, weird bridge camera that they did. But just wanted to say thanks, everybody, and have a good night.
Good night,
For
everybody.
having me. Bye. It was
Good
nice
night,
talking to everybody.
All right, bye
Thanks,
bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Hey, we went through a whole episode and didn't talk about Cinestill.
No.
No, we did.
You-
I know. People are going to be so disappointed.